Hi, Cristi. Nice to see you again.
Hi, Thanos.
How are you?
Well, how are you?
Well, I'm fine. We are living in a very strange period, and we have to get accustomed to the fact that we have to meet more often like that, like we are now. Um, let's start from the obvious things. The part of your inspiration. I know that it comes from a book by Solovyov's The Conversations. And I know that you have read it when you were young, and you also made a kind of film, an exercise, an étude, let's say, into this some years ago, actually before Sierra Nevada. So I would like you to tell me this process of yours. It means that you have this subject in your heart for many years.
Yeah, it's true. But at the moment when I read the book, and it happened at the beginning of the 90s, the book was then translated, I believe, for the first time. I was into painting, and I never thought of making a film out of it. Never. It just happened then that in 2011 they invited me, Les Chantiers Nomades, which is an association in France that is involved in this kind of workshops and master classes and things like this. They invited me to do this workshop in Toulouse. So when I left home, I took this book with me. I decided, at the last moment, that I'm going to do this because I find it to be extremely challenging. Years before, I wanted to do this while teaching in the school in Bucharest. I had this intention to do some kind of exercises starting from Plato's dialogues. Asking this very serious question: can this become a film? Can this dialogue become a film? Is it possible to imagine a film made just out of dialogues, pushing a bit to the extremes, stepping in the footsteps of Eric Romer, or going further? And this is what I tried to do in Toulouse. It was not just a masterclass workshop for the actors I worked with, but it was a workshop for myself. I tried just to do my best in order to understand the approach of Romer, which I don't believe I understand, but this was one of my intentions then. So years later, 2 years later, I put on paper this script, and then we start looking for the money for it, and little by little it became what it is today.
I'm glad you mentioned Romer. It's interesting, although because you share somehow, although your styles are completely different, but you share a kind of common theme, which is ethics, la morale. It's moral cinema, and I remember that when you started beginning the first films, you wanted to make moral tales, six moral tales, and somehow I believe that you remain very truthful and sincere to this idea, although you progress artistically. Instead of making, let's say, sequels, you are making a kind of research, I would say, in a more philosophical or ethical way. But not only Sierra Nevada, which is a talkative, let's say, film, as is this one, but I found also very many similarities in theme, but maybe I'm wrong. Also with Aurora, this question about evil and what brings people to commit violent acts.
Yeah,
and Aurora is a silent, let's say, film, and this one is a more talkative, but it's I don't know, I have the sense that, yeah, I don't know how you feel about it.
No, I think you're right. I think you're right. It is something that is, you know, especially today, I've been caught. I mean, the last years I've been caught in a lot of, I would say, I'd call them small conflicts, and people who are writing about films, and not just about films. They wrote a lot of things about me, myself, and my position regarding a lot of topics, and reproaching me a lot of things. But for me, this was extremely surprising, because I didn't change. I mean, from the moment I start making films, my position didn't change regarding this state of emergency in front of the evil. I believe that we are on the point of feeding the evil every day. I believe it is very important to be aware of the fact that we are the result of a long history, and in order to find the right perspective on these matters that are having to do with our sense of meaning of life, to say so, it is important to try to do your best in order to restore not just the facts, but your own perspective on these facts, because otherwise it would be extremely, extremely dangerous. I believe, I truly believe that the systems are crumbling when the feedback is being altered consciously or unconsciously. So restoring something, for me, is vital. When I did the death of Mr. Lazzarescu, I tried to do whatever I could in order not to make out of it a sort of political statement. I am a political animal myself. I'm living in a city. I am a citizen myself. So, but it is very important to understand your limits, and to for me to place your place your bet on what is deeply human, not things that are being exposed to changes, you know, like you know, political system. It is going to change, and is changing almost all the time. But what is human? What humans are? For me, this is one of the goals of filmmaking. I mean, it is like imagine the filmmaking like act of a process of understanding of like a research into these matters that are being related to what we are. And it's a question mark. What are we? What is being a human? What is being exposed to aggression? What is being exposed to love? What is all this, and so on and so forth?
I was not aware of all this reaction, but do you think that it's happening because there is some kind of shift, thematical shift, although it was always present in your films, the previous ones, with the exception maybe of Aurora, but also, Aurora, were more, let's say, under brackets, could be considered social films because they had this naturalistic, observational, which is not missing also in this one as a style film, but this time you speak more about also not only philosophical or political things, but also about theological questions. Do you think the idea of God creates a kind of uneasiness in our times?
Yes, I believe so, and I believe that it is due to the fact that we've been always caught inside this conflict, and it appears to me that more and more this I will call it agnostic position, not to call it straight atheistic position of a lot of people lately, and created a sort of a trend. So it's like now it's more trendy to bet on this atheistic view on the world than on an atheistic view of the world. So I believe that people are not asking themselves the right questions because they are afraid of the answers that they might give. It is very hard to give a serious, rational answer to all these questions that are having to do with God. But fear, the amount of fear that we accumulated as a society, it pushes us towards these very easy answers. God does not exist. So I believe that the dialogue is the most important thing, one of the most important things that we invented as civilization. I mean, the dialogue and the friendship, for me, these are the most important achievements. But it is very hard to preserve. Somehow you are going to push your agenda without being aware of it, even. Because it is not like we are angels. We are not angels. We are not saints. We are humans with lots of with our closet full of skeletons, and we, in order to protect ourselves, we erase this from our memory. But it is not right. I believe it is one of the most important things that we can do right now is to assume the fact that we are sinners. From this, let's say, Christian perspective, it is called the sinner. From say agnostic position, it be called I don't know, failures. I don't know how they call this. But to make Malmkrog was also had also a lot to do with the fact that I was in the position to step into what fiction might be, real fiction, starting with an author that is not me. I didn't try to, the script, but the story, the dialogues, the story belongs to Soloviev. So I try to imagine a script in order to make a film out of a story that belongs to a man that died in 1900, people talking about things that were maybe fashionable at that time in this milieu, something that does not belong to my world. I'm coming from a proletarian family, to put it bluntly. So it is a different world. I mean, making a film with, I don't know, some kind of extraterrestrial civilization, or about these aristocrats from the end of the 19th century would have been the same. It was just imagining something that I didn't live through. So to this was a challenge. And I tried to say, okay, there is something in all this. When you are trying to restore some kind of a story that you lived through today, this story is going to be contaminated by a lot of tendencies, some of them natural, some of them completely, extremely mysterious. So we are going to alter the restoration of the facts. Let's call this subjectivism. Your subjectivism is going to alter the restoration, and we are going to. So this is a part of our life. This is a part of our world. We are exchanging, when we are talking about our experiences, we are exchanging our perspective on the experience we live through, not the experience themselves. And it is impossible to restore this experience. It is always having to do with some kind of a fill in the blanks. I'm going to tell a story, you are going to fill in the blanks. You don't really understand the details of the story I'm telling you, but the whole story, the big story, you understand it very well. And then you are going to build up inside my story with your own experience. We are talking about the hospital. I had this experience in a hospital. You are going to rely on your own experience as a patient in a hospital, and so on and so forth. But what about a story that happened long ago, like 120 years ago? What is this? I mean, how? So my own experience, my own relationship with that time, it is a relationship that is having a lot to do with my imagination, that relied on some pieces of the visual coming from the painting or the photography or films that are being made at the beginning of the century. But it's not more the films, but the paintings especially, and then the music. And so I try to do this and to keep from my previous experience while working on this film, just the process of building up a story at the present time, trying to imagine the film every day. Like this is this is the missing link between this film and the documentary approach, kind of a documentary approach. So allowing myself to work at the present time together with all the others, and it was extremely painful for every one of us, but just in order to allow ourselves to imagine this world and these situations and so on, and not to betray Solovyov. I decided to rely on my imagination, as I said, and to choose out of this imagination some kind of a profile of the humans at the time, which is for sure not realistic.
Mm-hmm.
They are talking like living statues, and it's like justifying the decision decisions of Straub or Bresson, in their films. Every character is talking calmly or not, but still they are allowed to speak till the end and to finish their sentences and statements. So more or less it was about this thing that is being related to the stepping into unknown.
Mm-hmm.
So I had to imagine a convention and to stick to it. And I said to myself, cinema was at the beginning in 1900. we don't know much about this. We know some things about what was happening in theater, and let's say we can imagine how the theater experience affected Zoro. Just a moment, please.
Yeah.
Just a moment. Sorry, I have to. There is a fire in the building close to us. Was the
Okay.
police at the door? We have to leave the building, and sorry.
Okay. So don't worry. Be safe, which is the most important thing now. And
we can continue.
We can continue after an hour. I don't know. If we just send us a message, just call. I will wait.
It's
wow. You see? No, come on. It's incredible.
See?
Somehow it's related to your film. Everything is happening out of frame.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Okay, take care.
So I'll call you as soon as I.
Okay, no worries. Don't worry.
Okay. Thank you, Thanos.
Okay, be safe.
Bye.
But well, the important thing is that you are okay, and I
step outside, and then this house is a house that is really
next to you. Yeah,
quite attached, but it's just smoke, no fire. But the street was full of firemen.
Yeah. Wow. Well, let's hope that everybody is okay. I mean, it's just, something that went off. I mean, I don't know, a kitchen or whatever. Yeah.
I believe so. It has to be something. It's after the parties, the end of the year. Some people going. Maybe they were not home, but it doesn't really matter. It's quite strange how these things are superposing on this. This event, which is very small and hopefully with no serious consequences, but on this state of depression caused by the pandemic, because there's a state of, it's really dark gray, gray state of mind of the whole population, and then you have this. Events like fire.
It's incredible. You're right. And actually, this was, to go back to your film, it was very strange to me because it happened out of our frame, and in your film, the most important things are happening outside of the frame, or at least equally important things. So. Let's speak a little bit about out of frame.
Yes, it's out of frame. Actually, what is happening out of the frame in Malmkrog is an event of a very serious magnitude. Not like the fire that burst in this building close to ours, but from the same family.
Yeah.
It can end with a tragedy. Who knows? We will see. We will check the news. I don't know. But in the film, the event that is taking place is extremely serious, and it is for me, it was, when I started working on the film, and I decided to do in the end the film, to make the film. because we had a lot of problems of financing and so on and so forth. But because of these French actors, some of them that I met during my workshops, they agreed upon the fact that, we are going to make this film. It's a low-budget film, a serious and a very difficult film with not so much money. When they accepted it, I said to myself, I have to do it. But before taking this decision, I was planning to give the money back to the CNC, because not able to make the film, couldn't make it with Romanian actors, because I needed to have this French language that the aristocracy was speaking at the end of the 19th century. And, it would have been really difficult to find in Romania. So I said to myself, I'm going to give the money back to the CNC, and I'm going to dive into the demons of Dostoevsky. So I was just finishing the rereading of the demons, and then the adaptation of Camus, Les Possédés, the adaptation for the stage, and then with all these residues of the demons, I entered Malmkrog. So this event that I installed in the film outside the frame, this very serious event, was a residue of the demons, like the connection that I made in my head with the executions of the Romanovs after the Bolshevik Revolution. What is common to us today, and I wanted to put in the film, like a lot of other things that you have in the text of Soloviev, very similar to the world today, was the fact that we don't see it coming. We don't see it coming. And we are ready to discuss it and to talk about it, to change perspectives and to think about serious matters and serious events, but we will not see it coming. This was these were my feelings while making the film. I mean, a sort of emotion similar to despair and lack of hope.
I understand, but do you think that well, actually, there is something very interesting, narratively speaking, in your film, is that the film, after this event happens, almost midway through, goes on. And I find it really interesting because it has to do both of the themes we discussed before about the notion of good and evil and God and society, but also it has to do with time. You never realize that what goes after is before, or it's really after. It can be both, if you like. And also there was a very interesting thing you make, is that after this there is also something, a small scene before the chapter ends as well. So in a way, not even the chapters are not the final thing, that there are elements of the next or the previous chapter inside the one. So I find this how the way you're dealing with the narration very, very interesting.
The choice I made when I start making the film regarding this chronology was related to I mean, I called the actors and I asked them if they are ready to do it, and they said yes. And I told them, listen, you are going to come to Transylvania, because I found this mansion in Transylvania in a town called Malmkrog in Romanian, that is called Malmkrog in German, because it's a German town inside Transylvania. And we are going to talk there about everything. And I'm not going to give you to distribute the roles. I want to see you there, and I want to read the text together with you. And while reading the text together with them, and I took the decision to change the names of the characters and to add my flavor, my ideas, my potentiality to every character, to leave behind Solovyov. So this is a part of it, the chronology. That's why, believing that this is a belief, this is a personal belief that history is it is what you remember of it. History is it is a reconfiguration of a certain event that you are going to made up out of the elements that are having nothing or less to do one to another. So you are going to remake the puzzle or remake the story unconsciously changing not just the chronology but also the meaning. It is that's why I believe cinema is important also, because cinema, it is not about the story that is being told, but it is about the way the narrator is telling you what he remembers about a story that took place at a certain sometime or never. So it is about the story does not exist. The story does not exist. It's just the storyteller that exists. So if it is about a storyteller, I said, okay, but then I'm going to sign this. I mean, I'm going to call this character Madeleine, and this is the last chapter. It is like a clin d'œil, like to Proust, the Madeleine of Proust, when he's talking about his memories of the childhood, when he's eating the Madeleine, and then is going back in his memory. So, because I believe it is about a memory. So I said, okay, so if we are going to tell a story like this, it has to be altered. I mean, the chronology and everything, but it has to have inside also the intention of restitution, because it cannot go like turning all this story into something else. I mean, you start with Solovyov and you finish with Star Wars. This is not about history as memory. So it has to stay in a certain limits. That's why they are very discrete. These elements. So you have the tree, the Christmas tree here in this sequence. Then you don't have it. And at the beginning, outside there's no snow. It is visible on a big screen, and unfortunately on a small TV it is not quite visible. And then you have snow, and there is a change in the chronology with like clothes and so on, and especially this very big and serious event that is taking place in the middle of the film, and but still it is not underlined. This just this one, because then after so it is a change in the chronology maybe, and this is the first idea that came to your mind. And maybe it's true, or maybe it's not true. This event took place before or after. Anyway, I had to install this chapter called Madeleine at the end of the film, stating by this something that is being related to our memory, and a subjective and emotional remembering of what took place sometime, somewhere. And at the beginning of the film, when I shoot this shot with the sheep, for me it was like was very important to put it there, and I'm trying to do whatever I can in order to escape this calophilia, beautiful images and so on, the postcards in the films. But I had to shoot this, and I had to fight a bit with this tendency of escaping this calophilia. So, but for me, this shot is very important because it is a superposition of two historical times. It is impossible to have a shepherd with his sheep in the yard of a mansion. It is impossible. They're going to cut his head off. This is impossible. So it is something there. It is a superposition of historical times, and it is, you know, made not just you know, to you know, there is a lot of significations added to the shepherd and the sheep and so on, and there is even a black sheep there. I didn't put this black sheep there, but he's there, and I'm happy that I am having a black sheep inside this flock. But it was like stating something that is having to do with what we consider to be the restoration of an event, and the part of subjectivity and the part of approximation inside this restoration. It has to be at the beginning of the film. So then after following the whole story, of course, we start wondering about this central event. But this moment inside the film is having a double function, not just that of an event that it is coming as a surprise, like all the big events in the history of the humankind, what I consider to be as such, and but also emphasizing the next topic. It is a completely different situation when you have characters talking about death without death in the frame. They are talking about death and afterlife after this event, the death inside the film. So is it going? You are positioning yourself completely different. You, the listener, the viewer, you are going to pay attention to this, because I believe that this last dialogue of Soloviev, and it is the chapter called Olga in the film. This is a part of the last dialogue, the third dialogue in the book of Soloviev. For me, this is the most important dialogue of all. So it had to be introduced. I couldn't find any other solution than this one. But at a certain point, while working on the film, being there in Malmkrog at the mansion, I talked with the production, with Anka, and with all the people there about the possibility of, and with Juana, who was doing the costumes, to find a solution, because I would like to have an astronaut in the frame. You know, an astronaut. I talked about this in an interview, and I believe they didn't believe me. But I wanted to imagine this sequence where, at the end of the film, where you have an astronaut entering the frame with a radio tape recorder, kind of 80s radio tape recorder, and putting a tape inside and playing a song of Bee Gees, and in slow motion. And because I was so I mean, it is a sort of side effect of a despair, lack of sense.
Tell me a little bit more about the characters. How did you work with the actors? If I understood correctly, when they arrived, you made some kind of rehearsals for a certain period, and then you changed. You gave each one the roles, and after you started shooting, or you already started shooting, because you also listening to and although you have an incredible, as always, mise en scène, you continue to have this precision on the everyday life details, also what is happening with the servants, how the food is served, the books that are coming, the vases that are going up and down, the little girl from upstairs coming, the general who's in his room, all these things that are happening parallel. And so you have I mean, at least I had the impression of watching at the same time a fiction and a documentary together.
Well, I'm happy to hear this. I don't know, maybe this is an achievement, if it is so. But this is maybe it is related to the fact that I'm paying attention to the humans. Mm-hmm. I told the actors all the time, if it is something that you can do about acting, it is just to assume the present time. You are here, and the next second you are going to die, maybe, possibly. So it is paying attention to this fact, this act, if it is an act of being. It is an unconscious thing. It is something that is just there, and not to show me that you are, not just to be there. This is very important. And we had the discussion about acting and so on, and you know, like usually you ask yourself questions regarding the behavior of these characters, because you are talking about a different historical period in time and a different class, and you don't. So we had to document ourselves, but still, you know, people are having 2 arms, 2 legs, 1 mouth, 2 eyes, 2 ears. I mean, the same functions of the body. They are eating like every one of us, but they are paying attention to some, you know, they are having their habits, and they are having their, but still there is something that is very important. It is what is related to the accident. I mean, to the presence of life. Because if you fall for your for this easy, cheesy solution of directing everything, then you are lost. For me, the best things in my films are things that don't belong to me. Of course, they had to learn this amount of text, which is killing. It means it's killing you. And then we had to do this composition. We have the first chapter in Grida, for example. You have like 6 takes. For me, it was important to have these 6 takes, 6 takes and 6 chapters in the film. To the point of superposing every take on every chapter in the film. So being aware of the fact that the moment she faints Olga in this shot, this shot is the 5th shot, and is superposed on the 5th chapter that is called Olga. So there's a playing with these things somehow, but still it is not enough. They had to be there. So this is something that they gave to the film. This is something you cannot control. If you are ready to assume your limits, then you are going to things are going to unfold following a completely different pattern, and the sequence is going to surprise you. You have just to trust humans. You have to trust people in front of you. You have to trust. You have to love them. You have to love humans. If you love them, then you are going to receive everything. I have to say that I grew up in a country that was a communist country, and I've been educated as an atheist, you know. And it is just later on that I discovered this. I mean, the sense of what Jesus was saying, and not the sense, that sense, but the fact that there is a sense in what he's saying, and it is just about me, that I'm not, it is because of me that I'm not initiated in this. What is being initiated? But first of all, is to listen, to pay attention, to listen, to read and reread and reread and reread, and think, and observe. When I was like 17, I was having these fights with my grandmother, because I was finished like, I was 17, I believe. I just finished this book of Bertrand Russell, Why I'm Not a Christian. And then I went to my grandmother to develop the thing, to explain her why I'm not a Christian.
Your grandmother was someone who had faith, or no?
Yeah, she was very faithful. Okay. But she was doing things in the tradition. And so doing things in the tradition, it's something, and explaining the parable of the fig tree is a completely different thing.
Yeah, of course.
She told me just this: Christian, pay attention to what you are saying, because this is blasphemy. Explain me, why is blasphemy? I can say this and that. Why I'm not free to say this? Pay attention. No explanations. I was waiting for some kind of explanation. Bertrand Russell, and then my grandmother, because she was, well, you know, in an Orthodox church, you are doing things like, you know, praying and doing things, and then you know, metani, doing.
Yeah. But well, she was not an intellectual, I guess. But she was.
No, a peasant.
So you were. I mean, I understand that you're disillusioned that she didn't have the answers you wanted, but maybe somehow she helped you becoming who you are.
Of course, this is true. I believe it is so. But what I was waiting for her, you know, because you see that somebody was completely stupid. What I was waiting for her, because what she was doing something that was having more to do with the belief, a belief that I couldn't configure it myself in my brain, because this cannot be explained, rationally explained, a belief. So she couldn't explain me nothing. So inviting her on this ground of rational debate was completely stupid from the start for me. But I took advantage of it, because I fed my convictions. She knows nothing. It means that, yes, the Marxists are right. The religion is the opium of the people. Period, full stop. Which is not true. But anyway, to make a long story short, soon after the falling down of the communism, some publishing houses, they start releasing, publishing books belonging to people that survived the communist gulag, being Romanian or Russian. So I start reading lots of testimonies and things coming from people that were Christian and talking about a lot of topics. It is the case of Nicolae Steinhardt, who is an intellectual, art critic and literary critic, and who spent like 6 years in a jail in Romania, and then he converted to Eastern Christianity, Orthodox, Greek, Russian, what have you, Romanian Orthodox Christianity, and he wrote this book called the Diary of Happiness, and then he is talking about this, and in his next books, several books he wrote after the liberation from the prison. After he wrote books about. He became a monk actually, and then he was talking about. So I found myself in front of this situation, having an interpretation coming from Bertrand Russell, and then this interpretation of somebody who went in a prison, horrible 6 years spent in prison because he I mean, because he used to meet with some other intellectuals and talk about books that were banned during that time. As to make a long story short, he didn't kill nobody. Anyway, but they were banned by the communist regime. So you have this interpretation of, I had this interpretation of Bertrand Russell and interpretation of Steinhardt, and said, I mean, it's very, I mean, this is an important intellectual, Bertrand Russell, and this is a guy that unknown for most of the people on this planet, a very smart, clever, educated man, and a very solid argument on this specific topic of the fig tree parable. And it was, for me, it was the turning point. It was the moment when I read Solovyov and I read La part du diable of Denis de Rougemont. And then I discovered that the world is made out of some other things, not just science and this amount of information that I received through this atheistic education. You know, I believe the text of Solovyov is having this. When I start thinking of it as a film, making a film out of it, I thought of it as like as such. As, you know, it's a text that can triggers dialogue and debate. It's too easy. We tend to forget too easy that what we are today is in part due to this belief, this urge of explaining the world from different perspectives, including theology, including the experience of the monks in the desert. It's very complex. It's very complex.
What do you think the audience now? I mean, when you planned this film and you knew it would be long and it would be full of dialogue, of arguments of these characters, and this dialogue is about very precise ideas and very dense, and I wouldn't say difficult, but I would say dense, and however you need a certain level of education to follow. So in a way, it's a demanding task for you, for your collaborators, for your actors, but also for us, the audience, right? So in a way, I feel that we are taken into a journey that I guess if someone doesn't want to, he doesn't have to do it. But you have to enter. I mean, at least this is how I felt it. You have to enter blank and ready to be under brackets with a good sense of the word, to surrender yourself to the film, and then we can debate as we are now, and we can forever. When you had this in mind, but did you had also in mind where the film would be seen? Because now with the pandemic, you can't see this film on the big screen where you put your clothes, you go there like you make an appointment with yourself and with you to spend 4 hours of your life there concentrated. It's a different approach. Have you thought about that? How does it change somehow the film?
It's true, it changes. Yes, it's true. But at the start, yes, I thought of all these things. But you see, my experience through cinema is the experience of an ordinary man, child. You know, I was very much attached when I was young to westerns and film noir, action films. I didn't propose to myself to become a director. This came later on. and then I discovered these difficult directors, a lot of directors that are very difficult if you are not trained. Like, for example, I just mentioned Jean-Marie Straub. Or, I don't know, you have Tarkovsky that appear to be like, sort of emblematic director for the, Hermetic cinema, or anyway in Romania for a period of time. But there are films that are requiring more than just you to sit there and having your popcorn and your Coca-Cola in order to watch them. So it's like for the books, there are books that are difficult. I said to myself, okay, if there are books that are difficult, there are films that are difficult, and there is music that is very difficult if you're not initiated. It's very hard to hear because you don't know what to pay attention to. So it is about some kind of initiation. So it applies to all the domains of human creativity. It applies to film as well. I just had this experience as a viewer. So I had to choose. Either I'm going to cut the text and to get to the film of 101 minutes, I don't know, 120. But it would have been a sort of, for me, it would have been surrender. Surrendering in front of an imposition that is having nothing to do with filmmaking, but just with the comfort of the viewer, which I respect and I understand when people are leaving the cinema, and I'm not offended by this. I am doing this. I'm watching the duration of a film. 3 hours and 20, I'm not going to see this. At least I'm not going to see it now. But when I had this experience long ago, when I saw for the first time, I believe it was after the shooting of my first film. It was in 2000. So in 2000, I was 33 years old, and I saw for the first time La Maman et la Putain, and it's 3 hours and I don't know, 215 minutes, something like that. It was a very crucial experience for me. Very crucial experience, and I can say a lot of things about this film. I mean, I watch it and rewatch it several times, and then later on, I saw the films of Wang Bing. It was wow, and they are long, and then so all these problems that are being related to difficulty of the perception of the assimilation. I don't know, of the relationship that you might install with the film, with the artistic object. Is an artistic this object in front of your eyes, then became secondary. You have to sacrifice something. So am I going to sacrifice what is important to me, for me, in this text, or what am I going to do? So there were bits, important parts of the text that were important to me, and there were parts of the text that I could live without them. So, I believe that in the end we cut out of the text like 30%, and we have the film. But at the same time, I changed the profile of the characters. Like, for example, in the text of Soloviev, there was a general. So I switched the position of the general. I put his wife in his position, and this for reasons of equality, to say so. I mean, to have a well-balanced dialogue, because in the text of Soloviev, which works in the text of Soloviev, I believe, does not work for me in a film, because the general was telling the story that happened to him while on the battlefield, and amongst everyone there, he was the single who experienced death in this form. So it was too strong of an argument coming from somebody who lived through it, through this experience. So I believe, but it doesn't work. So he has to spoke through an ambassador, his wife. I said, his wife. She loves him to the point of identifying herself with him, like in the old tradition. That's why it's another reason why I decided that in Grida, she's not going to change her dress. She's going to be dressed in red, this color, this royal color from the beginning till the end, and to point out the fact that she is representing the tradition. And the inertia of a long tradition is very hard to fight against her. She's very strong on her position, and she's having the position of the general in the book of Solovyov. But for me, it was important for her to become an ambassador of not to be there on the battlefield. So all this experience of the battlefield, all the horrors of the war, to come to us through this letter. Like, intermediaries, because it's true that most of us, those who are entering the cinema, did not experience this, didn't have these extreme experiences of war or different other cataclysms. So there were some changes, like 30% of the text that I took off, the change of the profile of the character, making out of the general a woman, making out of the prince another woman, was the prince turned into Olga, a countess, and making out of this the twin figure of Nikolai. There is a sense in it. So I made some interventions, but according with my perspective on things and on this matter, especially on the world as a whole. But it is true that the tendency of restoring as correct the text of Solovyov was there too. So you are being cut in, you are making a film based on a book and on an experience that is not yours. But you are there. It is about the fact that you is going to make the film. You are going to make the film. So it is very hard to. No, it's not hard. It is impossible to restore something, not even your experiences. This is Sierra Nevada was based on my experience after the death of my father, when we found ourselves at this table, and we had lots of discussions. And I kept the name of, like in Sierra Nevada, if you remember, there is this character, old lady called Evelina, and this is the friend of my mother, and I was the one who fought with her about communism and things, and that my brother didn't remember, and so it's very hard to restore your own experiences. What else to say about restoring the view of Solovyov? So you have to, in a way, you have to surrender this tendency, to avoid this, to kill this tendency, just to leave aside. It's not important. It is just a temptation. It is not true. It is an illusion. So you better forget this and start asking yourself the questions. And I start asking myself the question, and I said, no, this guy is not going to be called Mr. Z. He's going to be called Nikolai, like a resonance of the name of the Tsar, like a resonance of the saint, the protector of the child, like a resonance of the Nike from Greek, that is victory. For me, this is the position, the right position, the position of Nikolai. Some people found him to be too harsh on Olga. I don't. Like, thinking that they are brothers, I'm sorry, but you cannot enter this field. Brothers are having their codes. The outsiders might think that he's too harsh or she's too harsh, because later on the episode, Madeleine, he is apologizing and she's like, send him away. Give me a break. If you want to believe in such mythologies and so on. So it's like a fair fight between them. So like always, I'm trying to find the right tone. It is not sure if I found the right tone, but this is one of my engines. Not I mean to. I believe that restoring the text of Solovyov had more to do with allowing the viewer to get in contact with these ideas. And this true 3 hours and 20 minutes is killing you. And with the subtitles, it's killing you. But it has to be taken as such. I don't know. I don't know. It is like a book that you are going to read several times in order to understand. If there is something there that triggers your attention and your curiosity, I don't know.
But it's true. But speaking about characters, you have also this very important character that doesn't speak in the film that much, which is Istvan. And you dedicate the servant. You dedicate a chapter on him as well. So you switch also the point of view to the other side as well, and we see him also exert his power to the people who are, under him. When
of course. You notice this. Some people noticed, and some other people talked about this. The fact that they are working, that these servants working for the aristocrats, but this was a pattern. It was a moment in time where people were being involved in this kind of relationship. It is not like the aristocrats being mean towards the servants. Some, yes, some were mean, some don't, but at the same time, noticing that there is this hierarchical model, it puts Istvan in a position of amending one of his employees. I don't know.
Under servant. He's
It is not idealizing. For me, the servant was important because in the book of Solovyov, the action is taking place in Cannes, I believe, and in a garden outside, plein air. For me, it had to be inside. It had to be the model of the world as a house, as a closed space. For me, it was at that time much proper, and had to be winter in order to feel like homey, not being in a prison, but in a house that is warm, and there are those people who are taking care of us, and there is some kind of bit amount of sufferance because this is an old man in the back room there, and within sufferance, obviously. So it's like then there is a kid, so there is the promise of the future somewhere, and the kid is called Zoe. Actually, is my daughter. It's called Zoe, and it's having a huge signification in Greek, and for us, it's like it's the correspondent of Eve, from Hebrew in Greek. So it's for me, it has to be this, and the first word in this film is Zoe. She's calling her Zoe, Zoichka. Come here, come. Let's enter the house. Let's come inside. So it's like it has to be. I had to play this kind of. I don't know, optimism somehow. There's like hope. Place hope here and there, and in a story that is it turns around an event that is about death, being this death related to the revolution, being related to this and that. What I wanted to have in the film, which is true, is were the servants, because I am identifying myself with the servants, not with. It is something that I know because I'm coming from a proletarian family. I know very nothing, very little about aristocracy, but the idea of having Istvan in the background after the shootings came on the set, and he's there with the reason, and that's why I decided in the editing room to give him a place. At the beginning, while on the set, I had in my mind to have the film split in 3 segments, being called after the characters that I'm going to choose.
Okay.
But following the model of the book, the 3 dialogues. And then in the editing room, I start thinking and rethinking and watching, and it appeared to me that it was completely wrong. We are having here a story with 6 characters, not like in Pirandello's, but
okay.
Because on the set I had I started with this the dialogue. The first dialogue was in Grida, like in the first dialogue of Solovyov. The general is leading the dialogue. The second one was the dialogue of the politician, was Edouard, and the third one was Mr. Z in Solovyov. So Nikolai. So in Grida, Edouard, Nikolai became in Grida, Istvan, Edouard, Olga, Nikolai, Madeleine.
And speaking about Madeleine and the thing you told me about her, which is, I mean, the memory that comes back. Also, Madeleine puts in the end of the film, I mean, one of the most important elements of your film as well, which is the music. Although there's not much music, there is in very key moments, and there are some songs and the piano.
Actually, I use for this recording of Claudio Arau, which I like very much, but it's really anyway. Madeleine, for me, in a book of Solovyov, is the lady. This is the name of the character, and the discussion, the dialogue is taking place at her house. I decided that this is going to be Nikolai's house. And funny enough, while on editing, I realized that the Romanovs have been executed in the house of a guy called Nikolai as well. So I had to place the mansion in an Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this was a good opportunity for the character of Nikolai to tell the audience where they are, not saying Transylvania in the film. So this is one thing. And the other thing, why Königsberg? Because it's a disputed piece of land. And it is also the place of the homeland of Kant. It is important. But above all, it is having more to do with Königsberg, Kaliningrad, there's all this story of a very sad story of the 20th century. And not just this, and it's like an icon of the conflicts at the planetary scale. Conflicts because of the piece of land, which is someone called this piece of land's country, homeland, and this was one reason. And Transylvania, and then Königsberg, and then the third one, and maybe most important, was the fact that at the beginning of the film, while reading so many times the book, I had this feeling that I have to relate this, the whole story, to some kind of a problem of geometry or trigonometry or algebra or something that has no solution. So I searched for, or a game, like, and I found this Tower of Hanoi, this game, and then said, maybe this will be the title of the film. And then I found this much clever model for me to relate with the film, and it is this Seven Bridges of Königsberg. So I when Olga is fainting, when she falls down at the end of the first dialogue, between these two windows there is a drawing. It is a drawing of and is a picture of the city, of the town of Königsberg, and a drawing of this problem that was being solved by Euler, of the Seven Bridges of Königsberg. And I wanted at the beginning, when I started the project, to call the film The Seven Bridges of Königsberg. And I said, no, it's too much. But I'm going to install this in the film. So I have this image of the town of Königsberg, and above it there is something like, looks like a vertebrae or like a uterus or something like an eye, or it's confusing. You don't understand exactly what it is if you don't know this drawing. And then in the room, in the first in the opening image after of the film, after the shot of the ships, we are inside, and behind, next to the stove where Madeleine is sitting, behind her when she's leaving the place, is a portrait of Euler. So for me it was important. I mean, it's like a sort of attachment to the rational thinking, and also to a problem, in the same time, to a problem that is not being solved, because Euler demonstrated why it cannot be solved. So for me, the whole debate regarding the good and evil is an open debate. It is not, we don't have a solution. Or if we have the solution is Euler's solution, that this problem cannot be solved. Trying to, to find to relate to the whole bigger picture of the story that is taking place inside the mansion, that is not limited by the walls. It is telling us more than it appears to tell us. Like, for example, the horns outside, because the hunting is taking place when they are outside. We hear there is a hunting that is taking place. We hear the dogs, we hear the shot of the guns, and then we hear the horns. And the horns, it sounds like the chapter, the third part of Verdi Requiem, the trumpets in Tuba Mirum. It's like almost the same notes. And I don't know, I had to place them under the tree, that for me the tree is having a lot to do with the genealogy of Jesus, and a lot of these resonances, cultural resonances inside the film that made me understand the world like I understand it today. It is, I'm like, every one of us is the consequence of his not just own experiences in life, but his own experiences in relation with the achievement, that what is happening to be in this world when we were born. It is not like I'm not seeing the world just through my eyes, but through the eyes of the authors I read. It was important to have this servant coming with this encyclopedia to put it in the on the shelves at a certain moment in chapter Ishvan, it was important. Like, there is something that is saying something about the way, because we were asking about the words, and in this encyclopedia that they are putting on the shelves, this was a clin d'oeil to what our world is not just this, but is also this, the words that we are exchanging in the dialogue, and the significance of these words that we might find, if we want, inside the Encyclopedia Britannica or Larousse or what have you. So
yeah, don't forget, it's part of the Illuminism. I mean, the French Revolution and the Encyclopedia go hand in hand. So in a way, it's this, and it's a very appropriate way to end our discussion in these strange, difficult times. It's also an opportunity, and I thank you for doing this, to try to recollect from our cultural tradition and human experiences what we need to keep in order to put it through to the next generations. So I hope to see you again on your next film.
Sure.
Be good with your demons. If I understood correctly, this is what is haunting you now.
Yeah, it's
always a pleasure speaking to you. Congratulations, and thank you so much, Cristi.
Thank you to you, and to Nicoletta. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Be well. Be safe.
You too. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.